All right, hello and welcome to New Frontiers in Environmental Law and Geoengineering. My name is Chandler Randall and I'm the Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute, and I am so delighted to welcome everyone to today's webinar. ELI is proud to offer programming on cutting-edge issues in environmental law and policy, and it is such an honor to have you join us today for this special program. At the end of today's webinar, we will have time for a Q&A session, so please submit your questions through Zoom's question box, and please do not wait until the end. Send in your questions as soon as you think of them. I would like to thank our outstanding panelists for joining us today for this webinar. And while they will be introduced very briefly, the full speaker bios are posted on our website, eli.org, and I strongly encourage you to check out their expertise and experience in more detail there. As we begin, I would like to briefly introduce today's panel. Will Burns. Will is a visiting professor of environmental policy and culture at Northwestern University. He previously served as the co-founding director of the Institute for Carbon Dioxide Removal and Policy and the Forum for Climate Engineering Assessment think tanks at American University. He holds a PhD in international environmental law from the University of Wales Cardiff School of Law. Jonathan B. Weiner. Jonathan is the Perkins Professor of Law and Professor of Environmental Policy and Public Policy at Duke University, where he also co-directs the Duke Center on Risk. He was a member of the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report Working Group 3. Before coming to Duke, he served at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, at the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and at the U.S. Department of Justice. And last but not least, we have Emmy Yonakura. Emmy is a physical scientist at RAND. Recently, Emmy led an effort to examine the geopolitical risks of climate geoengineering, including an analysis of international legal mechanisms relevant to both solar radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. Her research portfolio includes work on climate change impacts on national security, as well as U.S. military readiness and U.S. Space Force operations. Emmy received her PhD in atmospheric science from Columbia University, and she conducted her postdoctoral research at Princeton University. We are so honored to be joined by these amazing speakers today. And before we get started, I would like to just very briefly touch on some of the issues that we will be talking about today. So today we'll be focusing on solar radiation management technologies, or SRM. SRM is a proposed model of climate engineering in which sunlight is reflected away from Earth to limit heating. As one might imagine, SRM is highly controversial, so much so that even small-scale real-world testing has been embroiled in controversy. Now, having said that, some will argue that SRM is an essential and relatively inexpensive tool to mitigate the worst effects of climate change upon humanity. Today's discussion will center on the ethics, regulatory schemes, as well as the latest developments in SRM technologies. And with that, we will hear opening remarks from all three speakers. Emmy, I will first turn things to you, then we'll hear from Jonathan, and then we'll close things out with Will before turning to our Q&A session. So Emmy, I will hand things over to you. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Chandler. And thanks again for this opportunity to have this interesting conversation on this really important topic, and I'm excited to share with you what I've worked on and also hear what others have worked on in their perspectives. So my opening remarks are more centered on just to give you a little bit more of my background on where I'm coming from in my perspective. I'm not presenting slides, so if there are specific aspects that anyone has follow-up questions, I'm happy to circle back on those in the sort of discussion and Q&A portion of this. But so this work was work that I conducted with my colleague, Michelle Grisey, who's actually the first author in our publication, who is the lawyer and sort of international law expert of the two of us. My background is a little bit more technical, as alluded to in my bio. I'm from a scientific background. And so that was sort of the part of the expertise that I led into our work. So my previous work looked at the technologies that spanned across both carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management, or SRM technologies. We did sort of a primer on what are these technologies, how technically feasible are they, what's sort of the rough order of magnitude cost What time scale do they have effects on the climate? And of course, what's sort of the laundry list of potential negative secondary effects that are captured in the existing scientific literature. We also took a look at sort of what entities, what countries or non-state actors had expressed interest or invested any, to public knowledge in research in any of these technologies. So things like stratospheric aerosol injection is an example of a SRM technology that we looked at. And we also looked at marine cloud brightening and space mirrors for some examples. We engaged with experts across both the sort of technical science space, but also legal and the sort of political science discipline, because we were interested in sort of sketching out what are the geopolitical risks associated with implementing different types of geoengineering. I will say sort of our broad top level findings were that there are of course many issues, even already mentioned in this conversation, the top of those being the moral hazard, the issue that these technologies are not fully realized at their highest technological readiness. Particularly with SRM, there's a question of maintenance. It's not sort of a one-shot deal where you do it once and you fix the problem. You have to either decide to keep on implementing repeatedly, or sort of in parallel enact other technologies as a portfolio of solutions. And of course, in our analysis of the negative secondary effects, there's always the issue of transboundary environmental impacts. For starters, just environmental, and sort of the idea that if you don't have global agreement, first on just implementing geoengineering, but also the sort of the details of how you implement them, you're likely to have transboundary effects of geoengineering that impact countries who are potentially not in agreement, and sort of escalate those geopolitical tensions. One thing we'll also point out that we saw in the study, that there's sort of motivation for considering geoengineering as an option to address climate change, but there's also no sort of clear voice, no country that is calling for solar radiation geoengineering, or really even a non-state actor who's saying this is what we choose. There are a lot of papers written on the scenario of, say, the small island nations reaching a point of, emergency where they might want to band together and implement geoengineering, but we're not hearing that signal, sort of in reality. And finally, I'll close, since, the focus of this is sort of the international law. We did take a look at existing international agreements that had relevance to geoengineering, and also, particularly to SRM technologies. One sort of caveat to international law is, all of these ran into obstacles with consensus building and have some weaknesses in terms of enforceability and who that, enforcing body is. But just as some background, the things that we looked at included the Environmental Modification Treaty, something that prohibits the hostile use of weather modification techniques. This is something, absolutely relevant, but certainly with loopholes in sort of the hostile use or weather modification language. We also looked at the Montreal Protocol, to do with, if there's anything to do with ozone depletion. The Convention on Biological Diversity, in some of these cases, that's a potential risk. We also looked at the London Convention and London Protocol for the cases where there's, potential relevance with the London Convention and Protocol prohibits marine dumping and pollution. Sorry about that. And then finally, the UNFCCC sort of related to stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions, not as relevant in our assessment to SRM, but certainly to something like carbon dioxide removal. And so finally, to close, we do in our works, state that there isn't really any existing comprehensive geoengineering governance agreement. In short of that, we would recommend, some first steps to include something like research governance, some agreement on whether or not to even conduct geoengineering related research, and maybe specific to the technologies, and then also, parameters to make that research safe. We also recommend establishing, international norms to include things like notification, transparency, and verification. And finally, our last recommendation, in short of sort of international governance, to start with domestic legislation to provide some template for geoengineering governance that may be used in the future on the international level. And I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. With that, we will turn things over to Jonathan.
Thank you. I will share some slides. Let's see if that works. Do you see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Thanks so much for inviting me to join here. Always good to be on ELI workshops and conferences. And I look forward to the discussion. So my talk is about climate engineering and risk trade-offs, some of which have already been alluded to. And this is a project that I've undertaken with several colleagues. So we published a paper in March through the Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, C2G, and it's available on the C2G website. And I'll put the link in the chat after the presentations. And the lead author on that paper is Tyler Felgenhauer, my colleague at the Duke Center on Risk, and also Mark Borsick at the Duke Center on Risk, and we collaborated, and Matt Brune, and we collaborated with colleagues from India, Bala from India, Ines Camiglione from Argentina, Jianhua Su from China. And the purpose of this paper was not to advocate for or against solar radiation modification, but to investigate the multiple complex array of risks that might be affected by different, at least some of the SRM options. We also have another project ongoing, funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation, NSF, to investigate strategic behavior through the development of some experimental games to try to simulate how multiple actors would behave in response to different prospects or actions regarding solar radiation modification or geoengineering. And there we're collaborating with colleagues at Duke, at NC State, at University of Wyoming, Appalachian State, Colorado State, University of Waterloo. And we'll have more to report on from that project soon. So our projects observe that although there have been significant efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce or limit the growth of concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and I should say that that's been a large part of my work as well. Most of my work on climate change has been trying to design effective policy measures to limit greenhouse gas emissions. And before I came to Duke, as Chandler mentioned, I worked in the US government, including I helped negotiate the Framework Convention on Climate Change back 30 years. So that's been slow going. And the benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions include not only the reduction in climate change impacts, but also conventional air pollution and water pollution, other impacts from use of fossil fuels. There are also costs and risks depending on the new energy system choices. For example, nuclear, solar, wind, other, or natural gas as a transition, all of which pose costs and risks. But a key point is it takes a long time, not only for the change in emissions to affect concentrations and then to affect temperatures, because there are long lags built into the climate system, but also it's taken a long time to mobilize collective action among multiple countries and even domestically. It has been slow going. So some people have asked, what if we need, or what if some actors think we need a nearer term option to avoid the worst climate change impacts? And that has led the interest in SRM. last year, the National Academies published this report on reflecting sunlight that asked how SRM should be understood and governed, including SRM research. And it put front and center the question, which has been in view for many decades: could solar radiation modification help reduce overall risk from climate change and other effects? It's important to note, as Emmy just said, there are multiple techniques of SRM. They're not all the same. So in our report for C2G that just came out, we looked at stratospheric aerosol injection, SAI, and also at marine cloud brightening at lower altitudes in the atmosphere. But there are other potential options, including possibly space mirrors outside the Earth's atmosphere, or other approaches. In general, at least the approaches in the Earth's atmosphere, like SAI and MCB, seem to be low cost, at least for initial deployment, but maintaining year after year might cost more. Space mirrors might be quite expensive. The low cost has both a good side and a bad side. It's good in the sense that it would be cost effective, but the downside may be that it may be too attractive or easily deployed by a single actor. The SRM methods can be very effective in reducing temperatures much more quickly than limiting greenhouse gas emissions, but they're temporary, so they have to be maintained over time. The particles, stratospheric aerosol particles, would precipitate out of the atmosphere after just a couple of years, and they're uncertain in their full effects, and they're imperfect. And a key point here is solar radiation modification is not just reversing climate change, it's introducing another form of climate change that would have interactions with ongoing climate change and would yield a portfolio or a multiplicity of other effects. So there are a variety of risky side effects, and the National Academies recognized this potential for risky side effects in its report last year. And that harkens back to first book that I published back in 1995 called Risk versus Risk, which John Graham and I and colleagues investigated the frequent potential that an intervention to reduce one risk may yield other risks. So that traditional paradigm, both in individual psychology and in government decision-making, of focusing on a single target risk can prove can lead to unintended consequences, to ancillary impacts or side effects. And the more complex the system, the more the avenues and potential for pitfalls in these side effects or ancillary impacts. So we argued back in that book in 1995, Risk versus Risk, that we live in a multi-risk world. I also wrote a paper in the journal Risk Analysis 2020 called Learning to Manage the Multi-Risk World, that is a reprise of many of these themes. And that in a multi-risk world, we need to take account of not only the target risks, but the ancillary risks, which may be both harmful, countervailing risks, but also possible co-benefits from attempting to address a target risk. So for SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection, in our report for C2G that came out in March 2022, we tried to identify, and the paper is about 60 pages long, and so we go into some detail on both the biophysical and the social geopolitical side effects or ancillary impacts of SAI, stratospheric aerosol injection. So there might be benefits in reducing the worst climate change impact. So if we take climate risk seriously, and if efforts to mitigate emissions are going slowly, then there could be potential benefits in reducing the target risk of extreme climate change, or what's sometimes being called temperature overshoot, exceeding the targets of say 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial global average surface temperature. That might be on the risk reduction side. There might also be co-benefits, as you see in the lower left quadrant, some potential other effects of SAI that might be beneficial, but in our report, we suggest that those seem to be modest or small. On the negative side, so countervailing risks, there are both climate risks and other risks. So on the upper right of this slide, you see potential climate risks, including the potential that SAI might cause, not only reduce global warming, but cause too much cooling. And that could be because SAI turns out to be too effective, or we do too much of it. Or it might be because there are unexpected interactions. For example, volcanoes generate particles in the upper atmosphere that have a cooling effect. Indeed, that's where the idea of stratospheric aerosol injection as an anthropogenic initiative has come from, is observing the history of volcanic cooling. But what if humans were conducting SAI and at the same time there were an unexpected volcano eruption? Could that cause excessive cooling? That's one issue we address in our report. And there might also be regional climate impacts and changes in temperature and precipitation that might be regionally quite damaging, even while the global effect is to moderate the worst of climate change. And those regional climate impacts might play a significant role in the geopolitical responses. So in the lower right quadrant here of this slide, we identify a number of the countervailing risks. So these depend importantly on which technique of SRM is employed, or which particles are used for stratospheric aerosol injection. But among them are acid deposition. The particles injected into the atmosphere may precipitate out. Second is, as Emmy mentioned, stratospheric ozone depletion. There can be chemical reactions in the atmosphere and that would be adverse to the ozone layer and ultraviolet radiation. The third is changing the type and quality of light that reaches the Earth's surface. Light diffusion and dimming, potentially changing the color of the sky. A fourth we note here is termination shock, the potential that the SRM project might end, say, prematurely or unintentionally, or because of conflict over it. And that would yield a world in which the greenhouse gases have accumulated, and then temperature rise could be even more rapid than we've observed so far, with even more deleterious effects. And the last we note here is the potential for strategic behavior by one actor, could be a country or it could be a non-state actor, to be the first mover, or sometimes called the free driver as opposed to free rider. So instead of hanging back like a free rider and waiting for others to act, the free driver or first mover effect suggests there might be strategic incentives for an actor to go first and deploy SRM or SAI, which might be hasty, might be unwise, might yield both adverse environmental impacts and geopolitical conflict. And we note here in the positive or negative question mark at the bottom, this question of moral hazard or mitigation offset, because the literature is mixed on this question of whether identifying the prospect of solar radiation modification would reduce the motivation for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, or accelerate that motivation. And indeed, some studies have suggested that raising the prospect of SRM may motivate actors to do more mitigation. So it's, I think, an interesting and important question to be addressed. So here's the last slide I'll show now from our report, which tries to identify these multiple ancillary impacts or side effects of stratospheric aerosol injection, and tries to illustrate the point that they depend not only on the type of SAI that's employed, which particle, at which latitude, and so forth, or in which altitude, but also on how much, that is the stringency or intensity of the SAI project. So generally speaking, as you can see from the arrows here, the more intense the effort, the greater the potential for these ancillary impacts. So I will stop sharing the slides and look forward to the discussion. I'll just conclude by saying what we've tried to identify are some of the reasons for the acute controversy over SRM. And again, that our paper was not intended to advocate for or against, but rather to try to identify these multiple risk impacts. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And with that, I will turn things over to Will Burns.
Okay, let me get my slides up here. Okay, can you see that? All right, great. Okay, let me add my thanks to Chandler and ELI for the opportunity to speak in this webinar. I've had that opportunity a lot over the years, and it really appreciate the interesting fora and the opportunity to talk to people in the legal community and policy and science community on these issues. This is an interesting issue for me. I want to say at the outset that when I was at Johns Hopkins in 2013, I formed what I think was the first social science research center on solar radiation modification or management, along with Simon Nicholson at American universities. And a decade later, Simon is a staunch supporter of research in this context and potential deployment under some circumstances. And I've taken a very different route, right? I'm a signatory on a recent academic initiative that calls for the establishment of an international non-use agreement for SRM, which, as you can see, is capacious in terms of what it calls for. No public funding for SRM, no outdoor experiments, no patents, no deployment, no support in international institutions. The reason I point this out is to indicate that people of good faith, including those that have spent a long time on this issue, can end up with very different conclusions. And so it's one of the important reasons to have discussions of this nature, right? Because deployment of this approach or non-deployment of this approach potentially could have very substantial implications in terms of the future of geosecurity and climate policy making. And so I'm glad we're discussing it. And so I want to very briefly outline why I oppose SRM research or a potential deployment. And fortunately, Emmy and Jonathan both really set the table on a lot of the issues. And so I think I can go through these very quickly. The first reason that I oppose this is I don't see prospects for international consensus and international governance of SRM. And thus I'm afraid that there is likely to be unilateral or small club control of this approach, which, as you'll see, I think is potentially disastrous. So one thing that's clear, as I think both Jonathan and Emmy have emphasized, is that deployment of any of these solar geoengineering approaches, whether it's trying to brighten clouds or put huge mirrors in the sky or scatter sulfur dioxide or titanium dioxide in the atmosphere, will require complex global decisions, right, on a number of axes, including the places in which we would put these materials, the manner of deployment, the intensity of the deployment, the duration of time that we would deploy these approaches, as well as potential compensation if there were those that were impacted negatively. Given that fact, given the complexity of these decisions, and given the fact that we're talking about impacts on the global commons and likely disproportionate impacts in some regions, I think it's highly unlikely that we could attain a consensus in any international fora in terms of how to deploy SRM. Yet if you look at most of our international institutions, they operate under the principle of sovereign equality, one nation, one vote, as well as consensus. To the extent that consensus would be highly unlikely, there are large numbers of countries that oppose even research of SRM at this point, much less deployment. And I find it highly unlikely that that is going to change in the ensuing decades. What is likely, a far likely scenario with SRM is that failure to attain consensus at the international level would result in individual states deploying SRM or small clubs. And while, as I think Emmy mentioned, there's a possibility of smaller nations, such as small island states, deploying this approach, I think it's more likely that powerful countries would do this, ones that are viewed as having primary responsibility in terms of climate change, and also those that couldn't be stopped from doing so if they sought to do it. Unfortunately, at the same time, a lot of the potential negative impacts of deployment of these approaches would be visited on some of the most vulnerable people in the world, or certainly could be. As Jonathan had alluded to, it's possible, for example, that sulfur aerosol injection could have regional precipitation impacts. Some studies have indicated, for example, it could reduce precipitation in areas such as Southeast Asia by 30% or more. Potentially imperiling the monsoon that 1 billion people rely on for food, or at least weakening it. And we could see the same impacts in terms of the Amazon. Some studies indicate that deployment of this approach at a large scale could delay recovery of the ozone layer for somewhere between 30 to 70 years, and potentially reduce ozone as much as what happened in the heyday of chlorofluorocarbon deployment. Unfortunately, those states would not likely have a voice in a scenario in which a powerful state has deployed these technologies or a small club has. And quite frankly, there are some who view this as a feature rather than a bug of this approach, right? This is Jesse Reynolds, who's a senior policy officer for a new organization, the Global Commission on Governing Risks from Climate Overshoot, that emphasizes that this would be an inexpensive approach, a rapid approach, and would be possible without broad international cooperation. And I think any approach that potentially has disproportionate impacts on vulnerable populations and is not likely to be governed at the international level is one that we should not be looking at in earnest. Another reason I think this is true from a geopolitical standpoint is that it is likely to exacerbate tensions between the North and the South in terms of climate policymaking at a time when we know that the South is responsible for somewhere between 60 and 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, and this will continue to grow. To offer an approach that might be viewed as ceding responsibility might result in further imperiling those relations, and as a consequence, doesn't make sense to me. A second concern that I have is that solar radiation management deployment could violate the international principles of intergenerational equity. Intergenerational equity, the responsibility to future generations to leave them with the same options, the same choices, the same resources, or at least commensurate with this generation, is a principle recognized by many as one under customary international law. Moreover, under both the Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, it is recognized as a responsibility of those that are addressing climate change. And I believe that solar radiation management deployment could violate principles of intergenerational equity on a couple of levels. First of all, in terms of ozone depletion. If indeed it would delay recovery of the ozone layer for many, many decades, it would visit harms on future generations and do so in a way that was irreversible, violating principles of intergenerational equity. Second of all, Jonathan had spoken about the termination effect, the idea that if we were to deploy this approach and greenhouse gas emissions continue to accumulate in the atmosphere, if we were to stop using this, we would see very large increases in temperatures. As you can see here, we're talking about business as usual increase in temperatures of about 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade, whereas under the termination effect scenario, 1 to 4 degrees Celsius per decade, right? And this could overwhelm the ability of human institutions and ecosystems to adapt to a changing climate. Marcia McNutt, the president of the National Academy of Science, when they released one of their recent reports on SRM, joked that this approach would require a governance effort that would have to be of the same temporal realm as the governance of only one institution to date, which is the Vatican, right? It would require us to govern this approach for centuries, perhaps, which again seems unreasonable in terms of creating those kind of responsibilities for future generations who had no voice in this matter. Moreover, it would create a sword of Damocles for these generations, even if they wanted to stop deployment of this approach because they felt that there were disproportionate regional impacts that made it unfair to be using this approach. If they were to terminate it would result in massive negative implications globally. That violates principles of intergenerational equity by robbing future generations of critical choices in terms of policymaking. And then the last thing that I would say is it doesn't have to be this way. I firmly believe there is no real need for solar radiation management, and there are better approaches to address climate change. One thing that should be emphasized is that while a lot of SRM people like to emphasize that the sky is falling, the reality is that if we are faithfully implementing NDCs after COP26, we have now bent the curve in terms of temperature increases to about 1.8 degrees Celsius. Now, this is, of course, an optimistic scenario, right? It assumes full-scale implementation of all the pledges that are made, right? But it is a tremendous improvement over what we've seen in the past. And I would hate to see an approach like this get in the way of countries continuing to work in earnest to meet those kinds of approaches. Second of all, far more aggressive utilization of carbon removal approaches under the Paris Agreement, for example, could help bend that curve even further and help buy us time as we decarbonize the economy. And then third of all, another approach that could buy us time in a way that would be commensurate with what proponents of SRM argue is to address short-lived greenhouse gases, especially methane. A recent study has indicated that a two-track approach of aggressively reducing methane emissions from operations such as rice paddy cultivation, for example, and diesel fuels, as well as utilizing emerging methane removal approaches from the atmosphere, could restore atmospheric methane concentrations to pre-industrial levels. Since atmospheric methane drives about a third of global warming, cutting these emissions in half through this approach could reduce temperatures by the year 2050 by as much as 0.5 degrees Celsius. It could buy us the time that SRM would, while at the same time not creating the potential negative implications of deploying this approach from a geopolitical standpoint or an environmental standpoint. And so for those reasons, I believe that focusing our attention and focusing our resources on approaches that have more viable co-benefits, far less risk to the global commons, and are more likely to engender cooperation in the global community is a more judicious course of action. Thanks.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for these opening remarks. I think this really sets the conversation in a good spot. And Will, we just heard your opinion on this, but I want to ask the other panelists as well, and please feel free to chime in, Will, should solar radiation management be included in the conversation to mitigate climate change? Why or why not?
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, go ahead, Emmy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not quite on the side of firmly no. I would say through my research, and my opinion is sort of still undecided. I would say I wouldn't 100% rule it out as sort of that emergency lever. I've kind of heard that argument made that if we really if it happens that we can't reach those the NDCs of COP26 even, and we reach we get closer to the climate tipping points and more climate emergencies, it may be more likely that we want to reach for that SRM lever. And if there isn't any research there to make sure that it's actually a safe option or that it's actually an effective option before ruling it off the table, then I've kind of been in those sort of workshops where we work through that scenario where it could be equally bad.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, our paper is not advocating for or against, but it does recognize the multi-risk character of the problem. And so it's the climate risk, or especially the risk of extreme climate damages or temperature overshoot with catastrophic impacts, that is leading some people, scientists, as well as potentially government leaders, to be interested in SRM. And by the way, that's not a brand new thing. There have been reports describing the potential for climate engineering going back several decades, even to the 1960s. So there's the climate risk issue, which we'll discuss and which we'll talk about, how there might be better approaches. And I want to second Will's point about methane. Actually, one of my main jobs in negotiating the Framework Convention on Climate Change was to be sure that methane was included in the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which ultimately says in Article 4, all greenhouse gases not covered by the Montreal Protocol. But that sentence was sharply debated and hard fought, because back in the early 90s, there were a number of major countries who wanted the treaty to cover only CO2. And we made the argument that including the US government, the argument that if the treaty covered only CO2, that would encourage shifts from coal to natural gas that would reduce CO2 but increase methane emissions. And that's even more evident today with better studies of methane leakage, with new methods of shale gas fracking and others that have heightened the concern about methane leakage. So I agree with the point about methane as an important opportunity for mitigating future climate change. And so climate risk is one point. And then the second is, I think, the way you frame the question, Chandler, should SRM be in the conversation? I think it has to be in the sense of the conversation of analysis and policy options, because of the point that we've all made that a single actor could deploy it. So we have to be trying to understand and ready to respond, or perhaps some would say trying to deter the hasty, unwise deployment by a single actor, a first mover, or free driver, or rogue deployment. So the quote that Will showed from Jesse Reynolds saying it does not require international cooperation is kind of a double-edged sword. It's similar to a point that Scott Barrett made back in 2008 about a paper called The Incredible Economics of Geoengineering, that it's so low cost. So, from a static cost benefit perspective, that looks good. But from a dynamic perspective, the so low cost might tempt a single actor to deploy. And that could be, as Will was saying, very difficult to deal with geopolitically. And as Emmy's report also indicates, because it could be a powerful state that deploys. There are some studies suggesting, some countries that would bear the deepest burden from climate change and might have the capability to launch a multi-year SRM project, but it could be a non-state actor. And so that it raises some important governance questions.
Yeah, I just chime in by saying, I agree with with all that analysis. And, you know, Emmy's point is well taken, right? A good counter argument to what I'm saying is this emergency scenario, right? Where we reach these critical tipping points, right? At the end of the day, the reason that I come out against that is I'm more skeptical than Jonathan is about moral hazard. Or I don't, rather, I'm not more skeptical, but I agree with him that it's hard to know the valence of moral hazard, right? And the cynic in me says that whereas there are some of these modeling exercises that have shown that the public is so appalled by the possibility of deploying SRM and so scared about it, they demand more climate action. Climate has such a small salience for the public, right? If you ask people, the public, what are your 25 top issues? It's like 23rd, right? And so my fear is that if we had this magic pill that is SRM, the public wouldn't care that much if we did it. And Exxon and politicians would find this a wonderful way to continue to party like it's 1999. And as a consequence, we would reduce our commitment to reducing emissions, use SRM, and ultimately SRM would be overwhelmed by increasing greenhouse gas emissions, right? The studies tell us that you'd have to, as I think Jonathan or Enemy suggested before, you have to be simultaneously really, right, deploying SRM and reducing emissions, right? So you can stop using SRM. If you do the opposite, if you take your foot off the gas in terms of reducing emissions, you're going to need to put more of this stuff in the atmosphere or more in clouds or bigger space mirrors. And that's going to exacerbate all of the potential negative implications, right? And so I'm really afraid of moral hazard, and I'm afraid of not having nations that would lose, even if the world wins from this approach, having to bear the brunt of this, much as they have with climate change, in a way that I find unfair, right? But it's a very difficult question, right? And I think Emmy's argument and Jonathan's arguments in this context are well taken.
Any follow-up points?
Well, could I just expand for a second on the points that Will and Emmy have mentioned about governance options? And Emmy mentioned several different international treaties that may or may not apply. And so in our paper also, like Emmy's, we say there are some international agreements, existing international agreements that partially address, but there's no comprehensive international institution that would address this issue. And so that raises problems both for the potential adverse side effects of SRM, but also for how would we come to collective governance choices about how much SRM to do or whether to do it at all. And there's a question in the Q&A saying, wouldn't it be better if we had a structured, ordered collective agreement on SRM rather than individual actor deployment? Yes, but we don't really have a good institution for doing that right now. The Framework Convention on Climate Change has essentially doesn't really speak to this issue, except it does have in Article 4.1f, it has a provision saying countries should do impact assessments of their climate policy options, but that's really not been implemented very much, but that might be one hook. There's an environmental modification convention from the 1970s, but that speaks to hostile environmental modification. So there's, I think, an interesting kind of tort law interpretation of what counts as hostile. Could deployment with reckless disregard of the interests of other countries be deemed hostile? And if so, would that in some way mobilize the NMOD convention to take some action here? Of course, the country deploying or the actor deploying would say, this is not hostile, we're trying to save the planet. And there may be other international agreements, as Emmy mentioned, on the seas, ocean dumping, that might apply to some carbon dioxide removal geoengineering projects, or maybe some of the space treaties. But depending on the technique, maybe the ozone treaties if the stratospheric ozone depletion is an important impact. So there are partial coverages. And of course, the Convention on Biological Diversity a decade or so ago made a stab at asking to prevent or limit SRM. So there are these partial overlaps, and okay, last point here is when we looked at the issue of the first mover or free driver, one reaction we had is that problem looks more like arms control treaties than it looks like international environmental treaties. That is, the problem of needing to restrain a rogue actor from deploying a technology that yields benefits to that actor, but a kind of race to deploy by others that might be globally harmful. That's possibly analogous to international arms control agreements. So there might be lessons there that could be cross-applied to the SRM context.
If I could expand on a couple of those points. First of all, yeah, assuming arguendo we wanted to do SRM, creating an international framework in which we make these kind of decisions would be obviously the optimal approach. Again, I'm skeptical we could ever get there. One major reason is once the genie is out of the bottle and SRM can be deployed and it can be deployed effectively, different countries are going to want the thermostat set at different places. There's internal memos in places like Russia and Canada where they admit that increasing temperatures, at least for a while, is good, right? Because it opens up new croplands, it opens up the Northwest Passage to exploration. If you're Vanuatu, right, you want the thermostat set at far lower than it is now, right? So creating a consensus about this is not likely. One nightmare scenario, and it's I think it's alluded to by Jonathan's ideas about arms control, is that you could have an escalation, right? You could have one country deploy this approach and try to set temperatures at a certain level, another say we don't want that and counter deploy, and it could wreak havoc potentially, not only in terms of creating international tension, but wreak havoc in terms of the climate, right? And so again, that's why I don't want to see the genie out of the bottle. In terms of the legal institutions, I mean, most of the ones that have opined on this kind of give you a quintessential example of why international institutions don't seem ready for prime time when it comes to these approaches. If you look at the London Convention, for example, first of all, it focuses only on ocean iron fertilization. So one specific kind of carbon removal approach, right? And that resolution is non-binding, right? The London Protocol has expanded its purview to marine geoengineering, right? Which could include solar radiation management approaches, but you've only had 6 countries ratify that amendment. It's going to take a long time till you get 2/3 of the parties. And so nothing's legally binding under that regime, right? The CBD is passed a resolution. It's not legally binding, right? It is difficult to think of what international institution is going to be able to establish legally binding principles that countries will adhere to with an approach that potentially wreaks havoc with the global commons, right? And I just think that counsels in favor of not doing it because we can't create those institutions.
And I just have one small point to add before we move on. It's just that I think a little bit of a counter argument to my earlier point on even just doing research just to know that it's safe or to rule it out. I think part of that, importance of governance, even on the research stage, is where do we set the standards of, what is safe enough? What's the threshold? Is it even possible to rule a technology out once you've gotten the momentum and invested the money in developing it? And I know there's some examples in science and technology development that can speak to either side of that argument. But that's another sort of nuance that I've been thinking about recently.
Excellent. Well, this has been a great start to the discussion and really appreciate your responses. We have somewhat of a follow-up question here from the audience, and I think it fits really nicely. It asks, regardless of what you think personally, do you think global forces will line up more in favor or against the use of SRM as climate extreme impacts grow? Will, you've somewhat already answered this, but I'm especially curious to hear from Emmy and Jonathan on that. And Will, please feel free to jump in as well.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think even in as I started this work and then in conducting a workshop of sort of experts in the field, I was surprised that it wasn't already happening with the sort of the clamoring of doing call for climate action and sort of disappointments in climate mitigation efforts. So I'm kind of torn. I do think in the long run, if it continues there, I do see it as a likely option to turn to. But I think like at present state, it's definitely hard to call.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of normative or optimal decision question here, and also a positive, descriptive, predictive question of political economy or political psychology. So on the normative, if the worse the climate impacts are, the more the optimal use of even something that's risky to try to prevent those. So the flip side of that is the more we can prevent climate impacts through effective mitigation of emissions, the less we would need the risky technological solution like SRM. Or to put that a third way, those who are advocates of or trying to develop better SRM would be should have an interest in trying to make the SRM safer, in the sense of it reduces the extreme climate impacts with fewer or less severe side effects. Okay, from the positive predictive sense, will extreme climate impacts lead to the deployment of SRM? That's a good and interesting question about political psychology, political economy. And in the past, we've seen it's kind of a received wisdom that a lot of environmental policy is made after crises. And we actually published a book about that 4 years ago called Policy Shock, how regulators respond to crises. And in that book, we focused on nuclear power accidents, oil spills, and also financial crises. So it was not only environmental. And one thing we found was that even if it's true that crisis events spur regulation, they spur a very wide variety of different types of regulatory responses. It's not easy to predict what people will do in response to a crisis. And a lot of it depends on the narrative that's contested among different interest groups after a crisis has happened, who even determines, or shapes the view that it is a crisis, and then what's to blame. So it's hard to predict, but as a general sort of a prior, yeah, I'd say the more we see extreme events like hurricanes, wildfires, also just heat waves that have acute impacts, those may motivate key actors to want to protect themselves. So it's plausible.
Yeah, I agree with that. But whatever way I personally feel, as Laura has suggested, I do think that manifestations of climate change definitely could drive more discussion of SRM. And if we don't get our act together, right, and it becomes obvious that we're not meeting NDCs, for example, that will obviously drive the impetus. It's my hope that if we stay laser focused on what I see as the three legs of the stool, which is traditional mitigation, adaptation, and carbon removal, that we won't need SRM. But if we fail in that, I think that will clearly drive more support for discussion of SRM.
Thank you all so much for those responses. I want to turn things for a minute to talk a little bit more about single actors and non-state actors in particular. I think all three of you have mentioned this, and I'm curious, how real is that threat of or threat may be the wrong word, but how real is the possibility of a non-state actor or single actor taking SRM technology and deploying it? Could you talk a little bit about cost, the regulatory or lack thereof of the regulatory aspects, and then just any governance concerns with this as well? I know we've touched on some of these things, but we'd just like to take a bit of a deeper dive. So whoever wants to start, please feel free to take it.
You want to start, Jonathan? It looked like you were going to jump in. Go ahead.
So some basic outlines of that. Different estimates depending on the technique used and how many years it would take and so forth, but roughly in the range of billions of dollars to launch and maintain a stratospheric aerosol injection program using sulfur aerosols. That might depend on the type of particle that's used. And that might require a fleet of airplanes to keep flying and injecting the sulfur aerosol particles. But there are a lot of countries that have that capability, and there are even some private individuals who own airplane or airlines who might have that capability. And this scale of billions of dollars is not trivial, but it's low compared to the cost of replacing hundreds of coal-fired power plants with say wind and solar. So which also I emphasize has both climate benefits and other conventional air and water pollution and other benefits as well, but also possibly some land use conflict. So there are and there was, by the way, there was a question in the Q&A about shouldn't we also consider the costs and risks of the methods to reduce CO2 emissions? Absolutely, yes. In fact, back in that book in 1995, Risk versus Risk, we had one chapter just about that. And the comparison of energy options, fuel cycles is a classic kind of problem for this multi-risk analysis. So yes, we should consider all of those. Another thing about deployment is, would it be detectable? Could other countries monitor and observe that it's happening? And so, depending on the method used, countries would be able to observe the airplane flights, or they might be able to detect the particles in the atmosphere. If there were space mirrors launched, satellites, that raises other questions, especially with the development of very small satellites like cube satellites. So the monitoring is an issue that deserves attention as well.
Do you want to go next, Emmy, or?
I'm sure. Yeah, I don't have too much to add there. I mean, I would say it's certainly a very popular scenario in the literature, and well discussed and thought about. I've not necessarily seen like indicators or non-state actors advocating for them doing it on their own, or threatening at this stage. And I think it also, there's some dependence on what type of geoengineering or SRM technology, in Jonathan's example, I think you would probably be able to detect and even potentially attribute SAI in a fleet of aircraft, but maybe there's an argument for an Elon Musk launching a bunch of space mirrors, but and I know that you also asked kind of about the governance question. I think as far as our study got is that actually that'll be a big challenge and added complexity, but I don't have much necessarily to add in terms of solutions.
So I think that they call this the potential non-state actor, right? The green finger scenario, right? And you've already got Bill Gates and Richard Branson kicking in money for SRM research, right? So some people say, well, it may not be beyond that somebody of that sort that is a captain of industry, a techno optimist might try to do this, or a small country, right? I guess I'm not as concerned about that as I am the large countries, because I think that if Bill Gates did this and the world community didn't want him to do it, we would stop him, right? Physically, through criminal prosecution, whatever it is, right? And the good news is that any of the parade of horribles that we talked about in terms of negative impacts would cease fairly quickly after we stop utilizing the technology, right? And the same thing I think would happen to a small country. If Vanuatu did this and the world community didn't want Vanuatu to continue to do it, for better or worse, it'd be able to stop Vanuatu from doing it, right? The scenario I worry more about is the European Union deciding to deploy, or China, or the United States, or a grand coalition arguing that either sincerely or disingenuously, that given the fact that they have the huge amounts of the world's emissions, they're the ones that have to take the lead, right? Because they could do it, or one of them could do it unilaterally, and no one could stop them, right? So that scenario worries me more than a green finger or a small country.
Just to add to that, another potential actor there is India, and there are some studies that suggest that India might suffer disproportionately from climate change and benefit disproportionately from a cooling strategy like SRM. But so that would fit with Will's scenario of a powerful country that's quite capable of launching and maintaining a stratospheric aerosol injection program for many years, but that also could come into conflict with regional neighbors that would have adverse effects from the SRM project, including possibly China, or from a country like Russia, which might prefer a warmer planet. So, the Russian state climatologists were saying for decades that global warming would be good for agricultural productivity in Siberia and so forth. This is at least Mikhail Budiko in the 1980s was writing that. So you can imagine scenarios like that that would fit what Will was just saying. And that raised the geopolitical risks that Emmy in her report were emphasizing.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. Emmy, I think I want to start with you on this next question. Generally, how far along are scientists in terms of research and technology to even consider deploying SRM technologies? Is this something, if we wanted to, could we do it tomorrow? And what do we know and not know about that?
Sure. Yeah, I can start with that. I've definitely, when we were, writing the report and consulting sort of the experts on the different technologies, we definitely there's still kind of a range. I would say, especially for SRM, there's nothing that's like commercial off the shelf, just take it out of the box and use it. It's tried, tested, and well understood. Some of them are, conceptual, and even, aside from the technologies we've mentioned, people are coming up with other ideas and technologies. But I would say it's, one of the faults is that it would still take a great deal of investment in further research and development to get it to be safe. There's been a lot of obstacles to outdoor field testing, not just the example of the recent ScopeX project, but historically, lots of obstacles and backlash to even doing that type of research. and then kind of the idea of understanding it so well that you also can do true attribution of the sort of fallout effects that you might not have, to avoid the possibility of scapegoating, where someone implements geoengineering and then other countries blame that implementer for whatever environmental trouble they're going through, because there's not accurate attribution. So that is all to say that, yeah, I think I would say, at best sort of medium low, in terms of development. I mean, there's certainly there are space mirrors in space today for other purposes, but it's fairly understood technology. It could be implemented today as sort of like in a messy sense, rushed, not well understood, high risk. And I think that's where some of the worry and some of the scenarios come in.
Let me mention something about space mirrors. I think if what we're looking for is an approach that could be quickly deployed, that's probably not the one, right? So the recent MIT research said that if you were going to reduce insolation, right, incoming solar radiation by like 1.8%, which is what the goal is, to either turn temperatures back to pre-industrial levels, or if you want to reduce it maybe a little less, like 1.4, 1.2, to hold temperatures to where they are now, you would need a mirror that was the size of Brazil, right? Maybe larger than Brazil, okay? And it's likely from a construction perspective would take a century to build, right? I just think the mirrors are fantastical, right? I think Emmy's right. We certainly have smaller mirrors, right? And we know some of what they do, right? But the enterprise to do this in a way that would be effective is so titanic, right? That I think it's beyond the pale. My guess is that if we go down this path, we're looking at sulfur aerosol injection or marine cloud brightening, or maybe another approach people are talking about is creating bubbles on the ocean, right, to make them more reflective. That was, interestingly enough, Jonathan was talking about how we were discussing these issues in the 60s. There was a report proffered to President Johnson at the time that mentioned this emerging issue that we might want to look at called climate change, right? And it only had one possible solution, and it was to put bubbles in the ocean, right? It was interesting. I mean, again, I think there was a lot more techno-optimism in the early 60s, but that was one talked about. So, but I concur with Emmy. We're in early stages with a lot of these, and I think logistically, some of them, like space mirrors, would take so long, I'm not sure they'd ever be able to really do much for us.
Jonathan, do you have anything to add?
Well, I'll just add that I think the issues that Emmy and Will just raised are important and interesting, and in my mind, they raise a really tricky question, which I think Will's arguments also noted, which is that some kind of field testing or some kind of outdoor research, it might be of great value in trying to understand what the pros and cons would be or what the side effects would be. But it also, number one, has the potential. So that's number one. Number two is it has the potential for causing some adverse side effects. The larger the field test to try to be more realistic, the more it's actually modifying solar radiation and modifying the Earth atmosphere system. But it raises the question of what it would be perceived by other countries as deployment, and how the other countries would react if they thought that the field test was not just a test or was bigger than. And as Emmy was mentioning, there might be simultaneous extreme weather, or that would be attributed accurately or not. It could be attributed to the field test. And so these intermediate approaches that would be valuable for understanding what a global project might do could also themselves have sort of tricky effects.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. We have a question here that's about CO2 removal technologies. I know we're primarily focusing on SRM technologies, but I think it's worth asking, and I think it's an interesting question. It's a kind of a follow-up to the same question. It's how likely can we scale up CO2 removal technology to avoid geoengineering? Suppose you could call CO2 removal another form of geoengineering, but they also note like what Climeworks is doing. So I'll throw that out to whoever wants to take it first, but would love all of your input there.
I'll start because I worked with an institute that did carbon removal. Well, it depends on what kind of carbon removal, right? Is the first thing, right? Somebody mentioned Climeworks, that's direct air capture, right? It's this idea that you force ambient air through filters that have things like calcium hydroxide on them or lye, and you separate out the CO2, you liquefy it, and then you ship it or for storage or to use in products, right? And that approach at this point is immensely expensive, right? Maybe $600 to $1,000 per ton to capture CO2, right? Obviously not ready for prime time, right? Given what the cost of carbon is at this point. But they're working on pilot plants that they think could bring the price down to below $100 per ton, right? If you could do that, that becomes a viable approach, right? But it's going to take a long time, I think, to bring costs down that much. It's also going to take a long time to scale that up. There's other approaches. There's afforestation and reforestation, right, which we've done for a long time that are carbon removal approaches that could be scaled up. There's soil sequestration things such as no-till agriculture, right? There's an array of options. But what needs to be emphasized about carbon removal, even though I solidly support research in carbon dioxide removal and deployment, is one, there are risks associated with these approaches also. People sometimes, when they come out against SRM, say, well, but there's CDR, it's the benign kind of geoengineering, right? It's not necessarily benign in all circumstances, right? If you wanted to plant 900 million hectares of trees, which is what some people are proposing to suck up huge amounts of carbon, you would be taking out large areas of prairie grasslands and ecosystems in Africa that have high biodiversity benefits, and probably throwing a lot of people off their land that rely on it for livelihoods, right? Some of the ocean-based approaches could have some highly negative impacts biogeochemically, right? So that all needs to be looked at. The second thing is that this approach is slow. If you deploy carbon removal at a very large scale, if you're sucking 10 billion tons of it out a year, right? And that's a lot, right? You're probably reducing your concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere by 1 to 2 parts per million per year, right? So it's not a magic bullet. It's one of the reasons that people look at SRM, right? Because SRM can, for better or worse, have very quick impacts, right? CO2 is the long haul, right? So in my opinion, if CO2 removal is going to have a real impact, at least in terms of passing critical thresholds, we're going to have to research and deploy it more quickly than we are. The other value that it may have is in overshoot scenarios. If we shoot past 2 degrees Celsius or 3 degrees Celsius, we could use CO2 to try to bring down atmospheric concentrations of CO2. It doesn't mean we'll restore the world, right? There may have been nonlinear impacts or irreversible impacts of going above 2C that we can never save ourselves from, but it might help us to bring temperatures back down. So it has a role, but it's not a magic bullet by any means.
Yeah, I would just echo exactly the points that my study also looked at a bunch of different CDR technologies and found, yeah, definitely issues with scalability and time scale, and not the same maybe scale or types of transboundary effects, but certainly some risks of things like increased use of fertilizer and water runoff and things like that, and land use disagreements. But also generally the conclusion that it's potentially has some promise, but is really part of a portfolio of different solutions and not the solution.
Yeah, just on the time scale, I agree. Just add that carbon dioxide removal includes or could include expansion of sinks of forests. And back in the early days of the climate change negotiations, that was another hard fought issue, was to ensure that there would be coverage or recognition of the role of sinks in removing CO2 and possibly other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. But to do it faster, as Will and Emmy were saying, may require enhanced methods that have their own environmental impacts. So that helps put in context some of the opposition to CDR methods by communities like the Convention on Biological Diversity.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, and think it is important to recognize in this context, SRM is not the only form of geoengineering. There are other types out there. So really appreciate you answering that question. We have a question here, and I'd like to modify it slightly. So I apologize to the original writer, but I think it's a really interesting question. This person asks, aside from global warming, increased CO2 can be beneficial to plants. SRM offers a way to get the benefits of higher CO2 without the negative effects. And I'd like to just add briefly that there, and would love some further comments about the dangers of increased CO2, especially for ocean acidification and other impacts. So would just really love any takes from our panelists about that, about both potential benefits from higher concentrations of CO2, but also the negative consequences.
I'll start. In the shorter term, especially with certain kinds of plants, there's a fertilization effect associated with CO2, right? So you could see increased crop yields in some cases, for example, as CO2 levels rise, and we've seen some of that, right? You can see increases in forest lands in some cases as a result of that. But what almost every study tells you is that in the longer term, as CO2 temperature impacts really start to bite, you lose those benefits, right? Most studies, the IPCC, for example, emphasize that in the longer term, you're likely to see substantial reductions in crop production, especially in the most vulnerable places in the world, right? And, the total amount of food isn't that relevant, right? It's access to food, right? And if you're having areas such as sub-Saharan Africa see devastating reductions in food production as a result of temperature increases associated with CO2, CO2 is not your friend, right? CO2 in the longer term, the temperature impacts ultimately may turn forests that are net sinks now into net sources, right? Same thing with the oceans, right? We're seeing increasing evidence that the oceans that take up about 30% of the CO2 are being overwhelmed by temperature impacts and deoxygenation and concentrations increasing of CO2 that's changing the pressure gradient between atmospheric concentrations and ocean concentrations, resulting in more releases of CO2, right? So I think it's injudicious and dangerous to argue that CO2 is rising levels of CO2 are a good idea, right? They get you some short-term benefits in some context, but most of the impacts are decidedly negative. And I wouldn't want a policy that ballyhoos, letting the good times roll with CO2.
Right. Any other responses, or should I move on?
Yeah, I have too much to add there. I mean, I do see some of the point there that like the questioner's response to that would be that was sort of the point, like you would get the benefit of more CO2, and then having SRM on top of that would then take away the negative impact of the temperature. But yeah, I can't say I've had too much thought or argument on that.
And you know, it's a game because if then CO2 is good for you and you want to just keep jacking up the amount of CO2, you're going to have to jack up the amount of SRM, and all of the negative impacts that we're talking about become more dangerous. There's more of a threat of a massive termination effect with higher use of SRM, more negative impacts in precipitation, more ozone depletion. And so even though in the short term you're getting your CO2 benefits, in the long term, it's going to come back to bite you in a way that's likely to be far more catastrophic than never deploying SRM and simultaneously trying to reduce CO2.
So I just add that to the extent that CO2 has some benefits compared to other greenhouse gases, that might like methane or nitrous oxide, or the long-lived synthetic compounds, that might suggest that the portfolio of actions to mitigate climate change, the preventing emissions, should take account of the side effects of those different gases in adjusting the priorities for those, and that might put even more priority on reducing methane, reducing some of those other greenhouse gases. On the other hand, as Will was saying, there are harms from CO2, like ocean acidification, that may also not be associated with other greenhouse gases, or they may be different for each gas. I mean, back in the 1990s, there was a lot of, and we talked about this in that book, Risk versus Risk, in the chapter on climate, there was a lot of attention to CO2 fertilization effect on plants. But even there, it was understood then that there were different types of plants. There are plants that take in CO2 for photosynthesis with different kinds of, respiratory and photosynthesis processes, C3 and C4 plants. And so the elevated CO2 has different effects on those different types of plants. And then I think subsequent research has looked at how that affects other nutrient cycles in the plants and in the soil for nitrogen, for example. And so it's a complicated picture of how CO2 in the atmosphere affects plant productivity. And it may not be, it won't be uniform. It'll depend on the type of plant and the type of nutrient availability in the soil and so on. And also, I think many of the people who make the case in favor of solar radiation modification are not usually saying that it should be used while allowing CO2 to just increase in the atmosphere. They're saying it should be used to prevent the kind of emergency that Emmy was talking about, or to prevent the kind of peak. They talk about peak shaving, like flattening the curve, as we discussed in COVID times, right? To prevent the extreme overshoot impacts, not as the main climate management strategy while greenhouse gases continue to accumulate, but as a kind of temporary extreme impact prevention in order to then allow more time to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere over several decades.
Excellent. And I recognize we are low on time, so I don't think we have time for more questions, but what I would like to do is just offer, a minute or less from each of our panelists just to give closing thoughts. So Emmy, I want to start with you, and then we'll go to Jonathan, and then we'll close with Will.
Well, yeah, first I would just thanks again for this opportunity to learn and participate in this discussion, and also see the really interesting questions that were brought up from the audience. I don't think I've much argument to make other than, yeah, it's been interesting to hear others' perspectives.
Jonathan?
Yeah, it's been a really fruitful conversation. I appreciate being able to participate in it. I mean, I think what we're going to continue doing in our research is try to look carefully at these multi-risk impacts and try to, the paper that we published in March is mostly identifying the multi-risk impacts and drawing on the existing literature. A next step would be to try to identify the slopes of the effects. How much difference does it make? Kind of what's the dose response function, so to speak? If you do more of this kind of SRM, how does it change the relative mix of these multiple effects? That's highly scenario dependent. So that's a difficult kind of analysis to do. And the other thing we're working on is this strategic behavior, where we're developing with the colleagues I mentioned at Duke, NC State, Wyoming, App State, Colorado State, Waterloo, and others, trying to develop experimental games in which we test how people behave. This might be useful both for the moral hazard mitigation offset kind of question, and our colleagues, Todd Cherry, Dave McAvoy, Stefan Kroll, and others have already published a couple of papers on that. There was one in Environmental Politics 2022. That's quite interesting. And also to look at the first mover, free driver kind of question, and what governance options might help restrain first movers. So we're trying to look more at those questions.
Yeah, I just very quickly say, one thing I'd emphasize is I think what this discussion has emphasized is at this point, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? We crapped in our nest, our parents crapped in our nests, and there's so much crap in our nests now that all of the ways of cleaning the crap out have risks, right? And it's important for us to look at that. That's why I think Jonathan's work and Emmy's shop's work is really important in terms of trying to tease out, how one engages in comparative sort of risk assessment, right? And we may come out in different places, right? But it's important to have that exercise. And if we do decide that we are going to go down the road to SRM, it is important to figure out the optimal way to do it, right? So again, this kind of research that's happening in both these shops can be important, and hopefully bomb throwers such as myself will help people to try to keep asking those kind of questions as we proceed. So thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thanks to everyone for the questions.
Excellent. I echo that. I just want to say thank you so much for our audience joining us today and for your many thought-provoking questions. I know we weren't able to get to all of them, but I have them saved, and Will, Emmy, and Jonathan, I will send over the questions we weren't able to get to you, and maybe we can get some answers for folks. Also, just an enormous thank you to our outstanding panelists. You all have been so great, and just really appreciate your thoughts on this very controversial but very interesting topic. I personally enjoyed it a lot, and I know our audience did as well. Thank you all so much for your time today. Please take care and stay safe. And thank you once again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Thank you.